Hello, everyone, and welcome back into yet another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Today, here on our Wednesday edition of the show, we're going to be doing all things Thursday Night Football to start it out, starting off with our general betting preview before switching over to some player props for tomorrow night's game between the Bengals and the Ravens. Very important AFC North matchup there. Then I'm going to conclude my positional rankings for my tight ends and my defenses for Week 10 to look out for. And then last but not least, as always, I conclude my Wednesday shows with my weekly shadow report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I believe will define the fantasy football weekend for you. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you that if you want to see more content such as this, all across the network as a whole, consider liking, following, and subscribing to not only my show but other shows as well in the network and the network itself. But if you want to interact with our shows more directly while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do one of two things. Either press that $sign in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you have throughout the show. Great to get some more opinions on here because it just makes this show that much better, hearing your guys' input as well. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day, and let's talk some Bengals-Ravens for tomorrow night's big Thursday night football matchup. It's going to be one of those games where it can either be a shootout, and both of these teams' offenses, which are their strong suits, really shine, or the Ravens feel like they have that dominant X factor to the Bengals right now. I'm not necessarily sure if they do for enough periods of time to really say that they can play a complete game against a team of this caliber. However, I do feel as if there are ways in which the Bengals have improved upon certain areas of the field, especially the biggest concern coming in being the defense. They have completely shored it up over these past couple of weeks, albeit against weaker teams, and now I'm starting to feel a little bit more optimistic about their defense. However, I just feel that right now, even though it kind of feels like a one-trick pony type thing for the Ravens, it's working better than really any other offense in the NFL right now. So that's why I feel like the Ravens are the heavy favorites in this one, and are deservedly so, unless the Bengals can match them in a shootout. Right now, looking at the betting odds for tomorrow night, Baltimore is a 6-point favorite at home. The over-under is 52.5. Baltimore is at minus 240 to win. Cincy at plus 200 in terms of money lines. So as you can see, a huge discrepancy there for this game from a betting perspective. And the reason why is partly because I feel people are kind of put off by the overall outlook of the Bengals. Because as much as this kind of comeback story has led us to believe that the Bengals are back in this playoff race, which they firmly are, they're still not at the level of the Ravens where they can say that some of their losses this season can be explained away. Yes, the Ravens lost to the Browns, being led by Jameis Winston of all people, and also gave a huge lead to the Raiders, a Gardner Minshew-led team. The Bengals, some of their losses did unravel certain flaws in this team. Not just the Patriots one, a couple others as well. And so I feel like there's a point where the Bengals are a contender, but you're still worried about the overall outlook of this team, because this offense can play with anybody. I really love how poised and composed Joe Burrow has been this season, looking like one of the NFL's best. But on the defensive side of the ball, they've been pretty much inept in certain games, and against inferior opposition, they look like world beaters. So we can't really piece everything together when one half of the team is an enigma and the other half we know is one of the most excellent offenses in the league. As on the Ravens side of things, there are certainly worries there, right? This has been a narrative for them for the past couple of seasons. The fact that they can blow big leads against lesser teams. But now I feel like they filled the cracks a little bit. My worry about them last season was the fact that all of this hype surrounding Lamar was going to catch up to this Ravens team. It was going to be too much of a burden, and it proved to be in that AFC Championship game. Now, with the addition of Derrick Henry, you have a new component to this offense that makes it much more complex to defend than before. And I'm not sure, as much as I want to believe in the Bengals' defense in this game, that they can completely compensate for each and every weapon that the Baltimore Ravens have. Thus, the whole kind of game plan for the Bengals has to be score as many points as possible. And it's possible to do that against this Ravens pass defense that has been middling in certain areas. And so that's why I have to pinpoint that critical divide between these teams. I feel like when the Ravens lose, it's not alarm bells ringing. When the Bengals lose, you kind of have to question some components of the team. Yes, Joe Burrow can play well in the loss, but does it matter if his defense doesn't? If his defense doesn't keep it close, does it matter how many numbers Joe Burrow can put up? And a lot of people might say this game isn't going to necessarily come down to that because it's a divisional game and they're always competitive and we don't know how high or low scoring it will be. It is a huge factor to consider because before, I feel like this was a game where it stemmed down to the fact that A, Joe Burrow felt like the better quarterback, and B, had the better weapons, and C, his defense was complementary enough for him to prevail in games of this kind of importance. And so, looking at this game now, from how it's changed from the start of these guys' careers to now, is that the Ravens are now the team that the Bengals seem to have been a couple years ago. They feel like there's going to be some inexplicable moments in their season, but they can be justified because they actually seem to have more of an identity than ever. And so that's what scares me about trying to pick the Bengals in this game. It feels like it could be an attractive bet, you know? But with all the offensive weapons they have, the ways they can utilize them, Joe Burrow's play being a huge factor in this game. But it all comes down to the narrative shift here in the AFC North. It's going to come down to, the top team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, with a defense that is one of the best in the league, and these two offenses to try and exploit them. And so, when I look at the Bengals compared to the Ravens, I feel like they, in my humble opinion, might have better weapons to kind of challenge for the AFC North. But the Ravens have more of a plan put together. They know Lamar Jackson's strengths. They know his weaknesses. And so they have done a very nice job of compensating and covering up some of Lamar Jackson's flaws this season. And it's a huge part due to Derrick Henry as well, because of his physicality, his aggressiveness as a runner, and as a receiver as well, that really diversifies this offense. Now, the reason I bring the Steelers up in this whole equation is because this is a stretch for both teams where they're getting into divisional games. I believe it's the Bengals, who after they play the Ravens, and I have to check this, so don't quote me on this immediately, play the Steelers immediately after. Nope, the Bengals actually play the Chargers. The Steelers come in 2 weeks, whereas the Ravens, I believe, are the team that has the Steelers up next. So we're getting into the thick of the AFC North picture here. What is going to prevail? What kind of philosophies are we going to see come through in this division? Is it going to be the big play offense that Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals employ? Will it be the tactical offensive approach, knowing the strengths of your quarterback with Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, and the Baltimore Ravens? Or will Mike Tomlin just continue to win, just continue to surprise every corner? We don't know, but this game will tell us something, right? It will tell us how close the Bengals are this year compared to other years where it felt like maybe they were one step ahead of people. Now, we're going to see how far the gap has either risen or fallen between them, these two teams. And so, I feel like we're going to see a game that should be competitive, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens start pulling away at the end and really making this quote-unquote blowout here. Because it feels weird to place faith in two guys and secondary weapons that sometimes are worse than average in their style of play. But I feel like the Ravens are learning now. The Ravens have seen enough of Lamar Jackson in their offense to really make adjustments for how he plays, and it's working to a T for them, so I do expect them to win this game. But I would not be surprised if this were also a shootout, because I have to give Joe Burrow and that offense the benefit of the doubt. As much as it's weird to say it will come down to defense, that could be a big aspect, because on one hand, you have hope in what you see out of the Bengals in the past 3 weeks or so, whereas the Ravens have started to show cracks on that side of the football. But in terms of what I think can win, in the AFC North especially, a more tactical approach based off the identity that you've kind of crafted over the past couple of years of the Lamar Jackson era there in Baltimore. You now have enough, and the upper hand most importantly, in how the AFC North plays out. So that's a big part of this game. So I'm taking the Bengals in this. Let me know what you think in the comments. It's going to be an incredible game between two incredible teams, and I hope it's an exciting one. But coming up next, we're going to talk about some player props amongst, you guessed it, some of the best players in this game coming up right after this short break in segment 2. So don't go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you, like we did before, if you wish to interact with the show more directly through our live streams, consider yourself availing yourself to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can get your opinions out there, like I said, the comments, questions, and concerns you leave throughout the show in my comments section. I love reading them on air. Or you can also click that $sign in the comments section and leave a tip or donation as well. Everything you do is greatly appreciated by the network, and it just makes our shows that much better hearing your guys' input. Without further ado, let us continue talking Thursday Night Football. We started off with our general betting preview, which we always do for our Wednesday shows. Now we get into our player props. And this one seems pretty straightforward. I kind of feel like the best players will shine. The secondary weapons, it will remain to be seen. Because I feel like, the Bengals, out of both of these teams, have the better secondary weapons. I like that T. Higgins has really kind of matured into that very nice wide receiver 2 that I know he can be. I love what Yoshavas is doing. Gesicki could be a big piece in this offense as well, as we have seen in the past couple of weeks. So there are a lot of secondary weapons, but I still feel like the focus will be on the stars of the night, because the Ravens have 2 big ones that we know they're going to be relying upon. So it kind of felt like I had to reduce the Bengals a little bit just to shed light on what the Ravens are doing with these 2 guys. So that's why I feel like this player prop bet is much more stark compared to other ones I've done, where you have teams that really needed their secondary weapons to show up, and that's why I wanted to focus on them. But today, I'm going to hyper-focus on these players because of their importance, not only to their teams, but to the division race as well, because this is a highly integral game in the AFC North that will tell us a lot. So without further ado, let's jump right into this player prop segment. Let's start off with the Ravens, because we kind of know the story here. Everything's going to fall on Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry to kind of carry the load here. And I know it kind of sounds cliche, because these are 2 players, no matter where they are, whether Lamar Jackson being with the Ravens for as long as he has been, or Derrick Henry just coming to the Baltimore Ravens from a Tennessee Titans team where he was the focal point of what they did. These are the 2 guys that kind of capture the headlines for the Baltimore Ravens this season, kind of take the blame if they lose, or applauded when they win. So I have to really respect that aspect of who these players are, especially from a betting perspective, because they hold a lot of weight when you look at secondary options as well. When 2 players dominate like this, you have to take into account how this diversifies the betting market too. So let's start off with Lamar, because it feels safe to say that he's going to hit his over here. 232, or I believe 82.5 passing yards. And he's hit his over 7 of 9 times this season. So, as you can see, he's been a very steady presence as someone you can rely upon in the betting market as a quarterback. He is a presumptive MVP candidate, and that is helping bolster his case week by week, rather than just as in summation of what he's done this season. So, I feel like this game might be a bit hard to kind of agree with the over on this one, but recent history shows that Lamar Jackson is as reliable as they come. So that is why I feel like this is perhaps the safest bet from a Ravens point of view in this game. And not for nothing, as much as the Bengals defense has improved, like I said, look at who they've played. And that's what really makes me feel like Lamar's going to continue steamrolling. And he did it against a very kind of contentious Broncos defense, one that has played well, but, can get exposed when they're up against far superior teams that they can't really challenge. And so that's the thing about the Ravens. They can find ways to beat you, and Lamar Jackson is one of them. So he's going to take a lot of command for tomorrow night's bets. In terms of Derrick Henry, however, this is a weird one, because much like Lamar, he's been consistent. 7 of 9 games hitting the over as well. But I'm going to say, and this might raise a little bit of skepticism amongst my viewers here, he's going to hit the under 91.5 yards. And a lot of you might be thinking, how is this going to come about when, the Ravens' strategy is so dependent on what Derrick Henry can do in certain situations specifically? What he can do in the fourth quarter when your defense is worn out. What he can do in early downs and early quarters when, he can really set the tone for the game. I feel like his presence will be felt, but I feel like there are going to be moments where the Ravens are really going to try and stretch this Bengals defense out. Really going to test how long that secondary can hold up. They're also going to want to utilize the screen game a lot, kind of utilize the speed that we know they have. And so Derrick Henry's role then becomes more about him as a situational back and as a receiving back than I think people might have expected in this one. So while I still think he's going to have a couple runs to establish what the Baltimore Ravens want to do, to establish that there still can be a physical team, there's going to be a lot of moments where you see speed, aggressiveness, verticality kind of overtaking what the Baltimore Ravens do in this one, because they feel like this game could be a shootout. They're acknowledging, I feel like, that the Bengals have the weapons to hurt them. But my thing is that there are different ways that Derrick Henry can be utilized for this Baltimore Ravens offense, and I can't necessarily say the same if he had gone anywhere else. And they know that. So, in that way, different avenues for what the Baltimore Ravens offense will look like tomorrow will be opened. And it might frustrate some people, but it's mainly because this is a very important game for them. Because they're playing 2 divisional games back to back. And if they don't win them, they lose ground, and then questions are asked of what this team really is. So they're going to want to prove that, yes, Lamar and Derrick are important chess pieces in the puzzle that is the AFC North, but they're not going to officially decide it. So Derrick Henry, out of both of them, feels like a safer option to kind of take a step back and diminish his role a little bit. But still, in certain areas, I feel like he will affect this game. Now let's move on to the Bengals side of things, because this seems a little bit more, contentious, because there feels like a lot more weapons that you have to concern yourselves with on the betting market from a Bengals perspective. You have Joe Burrow, who you always know is going to be someone who is always going to put up big numbers, always going to get his weapons involved, always going to have the will to win, and you know that he's going to want to come out guns blazing in this one. But then you have to consider, is T. Higgins' rise something that can change a bettor's perspective? Is Yoshivas a factor? Is Gesicki's game from last week going to play in the minds of people betting on the Bengals? So that's why I feel like I had to pick both Burrow and Chase to talk about. And it's the same situation. I have Burrow hitting the over here, 263.5. And the funny thing is, unlike Lamar, he hasn't really been that consistent in hitting the over. Only 3 of 9 games this season as he hit the over. So this one feels like a little bit more of a flyer than Lamar hitting his. But it's mainly because it's going to have to happen for the Bengals to have a chance in this game. And you know the Bengals don't want to give up any more ground. So look for Joe Burrow to come out aggressive, attack the field downfield or vertically, and for him to, most importantly, try and make this the Bengals game. Have the Bengals take advantage of the situation. And so that's why I feel like Joe Burrow is going to rise to the occasion in this one. Jamar Chase, on the other hand, it was a little bit tougher to kind of decipher how he would play out in this game. But he is someone who I kind of feel like is hiding behind the mirage of this offense a little bit. I feel like, he's had a decent season. He's had many an explosive play. But at times I feel like this offense is becoming more predicated on finding secondary weapons to help Joe Burrow, help establish a different sort of tone, that people now have to account for more players in that skill position core to defend, that Jamar Chase could end up becoming a non-factor. And so that's why I'm saying he as well hits the under as perhaps the second biggest star in the Bengals. Because I look at this game plan and think for the Bengals, there's no way that Jamar Chase isn't the prime objective in the Ravens' defensive game plan. There's no way that the Ravens aren't accounting for him somehow. And so Joe Burrow is going to use that to his advantage and say, well, if you take away my best weapon, I have guys like Yoshivas, Gesicki, and Higgins who I believe will step up for me. So that's why I kind of feel like Jamar Chase is losing a little bit of his luster in these divisional games, because this is when you get into crunch time. This is when you have to start considering how secondary weapons come into play. This division isn't going to be decided wholly on the stars here. It's going to be decided on how people adapt to their stars being taken away and their stars not being the centerpiece of their game plan. That's why this felt so stark to me when comparing these two teams and their superstars, because of the fact that this game in the AFC North is highly contingent, not on who's superior and who plays like they're a star, but who can find other stars to help them in their mission. And so that's why I feel like I had to address the four big players in this one. But coming up after the break, we continue with our positional rankings, getting to an end here, but starting off with our tight ends today before concluding with our defense and special teams units to look out for this week. So we'll be right back after this short break. Do not go anywhere.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed those first two segments and they have you covered for tomorrow night's big game in the AFC North. But now we transition to our positional rankings, getting to the end of them here. But we start off with our tight ends. This is the position that a lot of people say is the X factor or the bane of their existence in fantasy this season, because some of them have performed above expectations, some below. And this list accounts for that kind of discrepancy. There's a lot of high-end tight ends here to account for. Then I wanted to include some guys who, I want to see get going and have matchups that I feel are favorable to them. So, without further ado, let's jump into our tight end positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL season. Starting off with a young man who is on the bye this week, playing in a very interesting game, perhaps the game of the week, at least from an intra-conference perspective. Pat Freiermuth going up against the Commanders coming off the bye are the Steelers, and it just feels like there's a new sense of reinvigoration within the Pittsburgh Steelers receiving corps, even though they traded for Mike Williams, and he's going to be a very interesting piece to how this AFC North race plays out. Pat Freiermuth is someone who I can't ignore in terms of how he can play into Russell Wilson's strengths, because they're still going to be a heavy play action team. They're really going to stretch the field vertically, play to Russ's strengths. And what I love about what Russ can bring, even with this kind of rejuvenation of the receiving corps and the addition of a guy like Williams, is the fact that in play action, he's always going to play it safe initially before looking for the deeper threats down the field. And so that's why Pat Freiermuth's effectiveness is really going to come to light. Because either the Steelers are going to become one of those teams who is going to stretch the field vertically, really scare you in that manner with Pickens and Williams as that deep threat tandem. But Pat Freiermuth is so savvy that you can still include the aspects of the Steelers that I really like about them. And I think that can really help them succeed in important games on the stretch. And so in this one, even though it's not yet a divisional game, that will come in 2 weeks' time when they face the Ravens, it's still a game of hefty importance to them because the Commanders are making a lot of noise, and the Steelers kind of feel like they're not getting enough praise for what they've been doing. And so this is kind of the game where we'll see if the Steelers can kind of shift the hype a little bit, can kind of say, well, we can't be ignored if the Commanders are being lauded in this way, then we should have the respect as well. And Pat Freiermuth can be the X factor in that, because as long as the Steelers have two guys who can get in the field, can put up points for you, you still need your guy who can unlock defenses when the going gets rough, like Pat Freiermuth, to really shine for you. And he will in this one against the Commanders, in my humble opinion. Then let's look at a guy who status is up in the air for him, but I still feel that if he plays, has a lot of value for this team. Dallas Goedert versus the Cowboys. And it's looking a little bit ominous for the outlook of Dallas Goedert. And it's going to hurt a lot of fantasy football managers if he doesn't play, because he's been a shining star at the tight end position over these past couple of weeks. Someone who has really balanced this Philly offense really well, making them dangerous despite the worries there with the offensive play calling. And so, if he does not play in this game, that is huge, because I feel like that will be one of those suffering points for the tight end position to look at and say, damn, Dallas Goedert could really bolster the case for me to consider more tight ends like him. If he does play, then I feel like this matchup is a no-brainer. And I feel like more tight ends like Dallas Goedert will find themselves being respected more in deeper leagues. And so his health is paramount to how I feel about him headed into this week, and it should be with you as well. But his status could really define how we view that middle tier of tight ends. If we feel that they can't be relied upon, whether it be because of injuries, offensive struggles, things of that nature, then I feel like we're not going to place as much emphasis on a position that's slowly kind of losing its charm here in the fantasy world. But if a guy like Dallas Goedert can really kind of step up, then there's hope for the tight end position to really expand its base to a much broader scale. because right now I kind of feel like we're stuck between the elite and the average at best. And so that's what Dallas Goedert might have to bridge this week. That divide between our standards and what we should be expecting from certain tight ends week in, week out. And another guy who I kind of wanted to address in a similar vein is Kyle Pitts going up against the Saints. He played Dallas this past weekend and had perhaps the most abysmal performance of the season, only 2.1 fantasy points to show in that game. And so, looking at that from that perspective, I kind of feel like the two guys who I've just mentioned, Goddard and Pitts, kind of represent the initial kind of thinking we get from the tight end position this season. Kyle Pitts is someone who projects as a lower first round to mid second round kind of pick in fantasy drafts, in my humble opinion. In other leagues, the deeper leagues, he may go a little bit later, and that wouldn't necessarily surprise me if he did. But he's still someone who is so highly regarded at the position that people are still willing to take flyers on. Whereas I'm trying to bring to mind a player like Dallas Goedert, who deserves just as much credit in an offense that is actually, compared to what the Falcons are doing a little bit, overachieving. When I look at the Eagles compared to the Falcons, there are more questions, in my opinion, surrounding the Eagles. But if you look at the Falcons, they really haven't done a great job in really getting the best out of guys like Pitts in this team. And they've suffered for it, whereas the Eagles, they're more suffering in certain situations because of the ineptitudes of Nick Sirianni as a play caller. And so, in that kind of tier here, that I'm expanding to include a guy like Dallas Goedert, would you rather rely upon a guy like Kyle Pitts over Dallas Goedert in a similar game? In fact, a game in which both teams will play against the Dallas Cowboys after this week, and say that, well, Kyle Pitts felt like the better pick for me because, he's the better tight end. It doesn't necessarily work that way sometimes. But in this matchup, I'm not trying to indict Kyle Pitts because he's still, at the end of the day, a very, very solid tight end. And against the Saints, he's going to prove, because the Saints, this one was much more matchup oriented. Against the Cowboys, it was kind of up in the air because, these were two teams coming in with kind of similar situations. The Falcons felt a little bit further ahead. And then obviously, with the injury to Dak Prescott in the middle of that game, it was very clear that the Atlanta Falcons were going to win. This week, I feel it's even more clear because the Saints just feel like they're in free fall right now. And just feel so safe to pick someone going up against them, in this matchup. So, as much as, Kyle Pitts has had his pratfalls this season, in certain matchups, he's still someone who figures prominently. And then the last guy I want to talk about is a guy who is kind of in a weird place right now because he was seen as perhaps the cream of the crop at the tight end position. Perhaps the tight end one in most leagues. And not for nothing, but he is in an offense that prides itself on its diversity and versatility. So, we don't necessarily know how Sam Laporta is positively or negatively affecting fantasy football as a whole, and most importantly, the tight end position. Last week, he only had 4.8 fantasy points against a divisional opponent in the Green Bay Packers, and that could be worrying to some people. But he's still an elite tight end, like I said. And I don't necessarily feel like the Lions will always predicate themselves on being an either-or team. They're going to have to, at some point stick to one game plan because the playoffs are a different animal and certain games are a different animal. And this week against the Texans, I kind of feel like more pressure's on them than Houston, even though Houston has a lot of deficiencies to cover for, a lot of injuries to account for as well there. And so Sam Laporta is someone who I really appreciate at the tight end position, no matter how horrible or stupendous he has been this season. And in this game, I feel he's going to prove his value in more ways than one. Even if he's not, targeted as much as you like, he's still an important factor for the Detroit Lions, and that is why he rounds out my weekly tight end positional rankings. But coming after this short break, let me know what you think in the comments about this one. We will have our final positional rankings with our defense and special teams units to monitor for Week 10. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available every.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. And we are in the home stretch of the show. This is our fourth segment of the day here on the podcast, and it is the conclusion of our weekly positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL season with our defense and special teams units. Now, like I said, defenses matter. And I said this at the start of the season. I'm going to continue to say it as the season progresses. Defenses can be the difference makers. And we've seen young, old, experienced, no matter what you call it, defenses either overperform expectations, underperform expectations, most importantly, prove that the defense factor of fantasy football is still alive and well. And these four defenses represent that ethos very well. Very diverse group of defenses this week. Maybe ones who, coming into the season, you were skeptical about, especially from a fantasy perspective. But all four of these defenses have proved to me that they can rise to the occasion, they can falter. But I really considered this week, because it's a very tough week for me to really kind of gauge which defense could shine. But all four of them, I do know, have defensive game plans and identities that I can get behind in certain matchups, and that is why I chose them. So without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit, starting off with perhaps one of the best young defenses in the league that's had a very impressive performance against my Seattle Seahawks. Unfortunately, but week in, week out, this is a unit that continues to improve, and they are going to be scary. And that is the Los Angeles Rams. Going against the Dolphins offense that, is going to be hard and tough to defend because of the return of Tua. But I feel like this team's strength is that it's starting to coalesce from back to front. Guys like rookies Jared Verse and Braden Fisk are starting to become more aggressive in the ways they can generate pressure, and the back end is holding up even more. Yes, I can, as a Seattle fan, blame the fact that perhaps DK Metcalf would have helped the passing game for Seattle, but it was still impressive what the Rams secondary was able to do, holding up in coverage against still very, very impressive and solid Seattle receivers. JSN still had a 180-yard day and could have had 300, but that's just me complaining there. I have to give credit to what the Rams did. And so, going up against another tough team with even tougher receivers to account for. Look for the Rams to be very physical. Look for the Rams to key in on Tua. Look for the Rams to continue their ascension into the league's elite, because this team is really starting to believe here. And this defensive unit was not the one that had all those injuries, but the offense that had a lot of worries week in, week out to start the season. The defense just, wasn't necessarily ready, I think, at the start of the season. And they just got thrown into the waters, and that's why a lot of people were a little skeptical about this team going forward. But at this current juncture in time, they are a really elite defense. And so I will be scared seeing this team in the next couple of weeks, and especially if this is a playoff team at the end of the season. So look for the Rams to be a team that you have to look out for week in, week out from now on. And then the next team I want to talk about is a team that's proven that against elite teams in the past can, put in good defensive shifts. But this is their toughest test yet, and one that they have failed time in, time out. One that has left them ruining the mistakes they made, and one that they've been working towards to try and win season after season. And that is the Buffalo Bills. Going up against, actually, this is not the game I want to talk about, but it's still, in the back of their minds, because I underestimated the Bills' schedule and said that they were hyping them up to play the Chiefs, which is actually in 2 weeks' time, but they are playing the Colts. And even in this game, this is one that I feel is pretty pedestrian for the Bills. Against guys who don't necessarily feel like they can hurt them mobily, the Bills are a very elite defense. Tua, was someone who could have been more mobile in that game, but chose to try and beat them with a deep ball, and look what they did. They were able to, and willing to sit in zone coverage and generate turnovers that way. Against the Colts, same narrative here. And potentially against the Chiefs, to try and confuse Patrick Mahomes in the pocket. But now looking at the Colts, Joe Flacco, yes, he did some great things in the Cleveland offense, but he's still very much reliant as a pocket passer, relying on his pocket passing abilities to pick apart defenses down the field. And if the Bills do somehow generate pressure, which hasn't necessarily been their strong suit this season, and that's another warning sign for this Colts offense that already, feels a little bit barren of big play threats outside of, Alec Pierce, potentially A.D. Mitchell. They have good route runners, don't get me wrong, and Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. But I feel like the Bills have proven when a quarterback isn't necessarily willing to extend plays and creative structure, they can stay home on receivers and force the quarterback to make silly mistakes. And not for nothing, Joe Flacco has had a very similar game in the past couple of years on his resume, that game against the Texans last season, where the Texans did the same thing. And so the Bills have a very similar game plan. They did it for the Dolphins already. Look for them to do it against the Colts and Joe Flacco yet again. And then the next defense I'm going to talk about, another young defense here. A lot of young defenses really stepping up and finding their groove this season. This one kind of had a little bit of a wake-up call. Not the biggest one against Arizona, but still one that makes me a little bit apprehensive including them on this list, but still nonetheless, it is a matchup I really like them in, and that is the Chicago Bears defense going up against the Patriots. They only had 6 fantasy points against Arizona. They had 2 fumble recoveries, though, and 3 sacks, so there were some positive to take away from that game. But in this matchup, I feel like you can really key in on a rookie quarterback making mistakes. And so that's what I feel like the Bears can do. They're a defense that at any given moment can flip a game on its head entirely. And they did it in certain situations against certain QBs, and they have been willing to do it with a secondary that is playing some of the most ferocious football out of anyone in the National Football League. And so, yes, this feels like an easy pick, but there are deeper storylines here because Drake May still is a dangerous vertical passer, and Patriots receivers are starting to trust him a lot more. Kayshon Boutte has seen a rise in his play. Demario Douglas as well. And so this could project to be a tougher matchup than people might think. However, going forward, I do know this Bears defense is not scared of anyone anymore. This is a Bears defense, especially in the secondary, that can really hone in on finding that identity for this defense that, should they potentially be a playoff team, will be scary to think about come January, potentially February. So look for the Bears to be one of those defenses that, yes, in certain matchups are a shoe-in to start, much like this one, but against better teams, have confidence that they can go in there and shut them down. Because this is a unit, much like the Rams, that's starting to coalesce from back to front. And that's why I like them a lot, even though this matchup certainly feels like chalk in this situation. And then the final defense I want to talk about is perhaps the most popular defense to kind of choose from a fantasy perspective. They'll always be there for you, and this is a matchup, that as well has gotten a little bit tougher than I expected it would, considering what the Bucs brought to the table against the Chiefs. But the 49ers defense going up against the Bucs, this could prove to be a statement game. This is an either-or game as well for the San Francisco 49ers. Either this is the game where they look the most impressive all season, or this is the one where they falter and prove that perhaps there are deeper, more underlying issues that you can't necessarily account for. And so this is why I feel like the 49ers are such a tough defense to gauge if you really look past the fact that they've been a model of consistency in fantasy for the past couple of years. This feels certainly very different this season on the defensive side of the football for San Fran. And yes, a lot of people were low on the Bucs and might continue to be considering where they are, but you can't underestimate them. And you can't ignore the fact that they put up a fight against the Chiefs, were leading that game because of the NFL's overtime rules, didn't necessarily get a chance to prove that they can beat elite teams without top players. And so the 49ers are going to have to eschew memories of the first half of the season from their minds if they want to move forward. Because the defense kind of did this to themselves. There were a lot of injuries to start, but they have been the healthier unit by far than what the offense has. So if they look inept in this game, I think this is more of a systemic thing than anything to do with, say, injuries or play style. Because the Bucs are a tougher test than I think a lot of people thought they would be. So if the 49ers think so too, that's bad news. But I have faith that this defense is going to be better than the sum of its parts this stretch run this season for them. Because I feel like they're going to buck up. This defense is too talented not to, and I can't say that, they're going to continue their struggles on that end of the football. So those are my 4 defenses for my weekly positional rankings. That will conclude my weekly positional rankings. Coming up in the last segment of the day's show, we're going to be doing my weekly shadow report, the key wide receiver quarterback matchups that I believe will define the weekend in fantasy football. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to conclude today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day's show, and it is our weekly Shadow Report. As always, I give you my top 4 to 5 wide receiver cornerback matchups to monitor ahead of the week in the NFL to concern fantasy football. And so, this week was pretty clear cut. There were a lot of divisional rivalries, a lot of rivalries renewed, but some that I feel like more about a team rather than an individual player yet again, much like last week, because we're getting into that part of the season where most of these teams are familiar with each other, whether they play them over the past couple of years outside of the division, or, they've seen this team year in, year out and know what to expect. So, throughout the rest of the season, you're going to see a lot more shadow reports concerning teams trying to defend a guy with one or two players rather than, just mano-a-mano, good old-fashioned 1v1 matchups. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into our weekly shadow report for Week 10, starting off with a guy who is not a top receiver on his team. In fact, is a wide receiver 2, but still one of the most skilled wide receiver 2s, most important wide receiver 2s to his team in the National Football League. Going up against a team he's all too familiar with, two guys he should be familiar with. It is Devontae Smith going up against Trayvon Diggs and CJ Goodwin. Now, this matchup is going to be defined, like I said, by this rivalry being renewed, by the Eagles' offense being familiar with the Cowboys' defense. And not for nothing, I feel like Devontae Smith can win this matchup because he is someone who I feel like no matter who he's going up against, always feels like he has the edge vertically and in terms of speed. I feel like, what this Cowboys pass defense does not have is someone who can immediately, on an island, face off against people's wide receiver 2s 1v1 and feel confident in the outcome, especially divisionally. That's where they're losing ground. I feel like last season was a little bit of a mirage with all the takeaways they generated, and this season they're getting a little bit more exposed. And so look for Devontae Smith and not potentially A.J. Brown to be the X factor here. Because Devontae Smith, can do both what A.J. Brown is more concerned with doing. Because A.J. Brown, he's a very unique wide receiver 1 in that he's the only one who, more often than not, wants to operate downfield instead of, be a traditional route runner. Whereas Devontae Smith, is a unique wide receiver 2 in that he can do a bit of both. So look for that matchup to be something to monitor as these two teams, so familiar with each other, try and figure each other out yet again in this divisional matchup. Then, the second one I want to touch upon is one that I believe is a first-time matchup. And this is one that is less important because it's an intra-conference game, but it's still, like I said, one of the better intra-conference games this week and this season potentially, because these are two up-and-coming teams who feel that they've arrived. And this matchup will prove which one has really made it further, because these are two young guys who these teams can have to rely upon in certain moments, especially in the future, especially potentially in a Super Bowl matchup that they want to figure out where they are with it. And that is Tank Dell going up against Terrion Arnold. This one's very interesting because I feel like the Lions secondary is very underrated, but it's not because of, hearing about their coverage skills, because this is a defense that over the past couple of weeks has generated a lot of takeaways within that secondary. Guys like Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph being big effects. But the reason why I feel like Terrion Arnold's going to be called into question is because, yes, the Texans aren't as well equipped as they would have been had Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs been penciled in for this game. But Tank Dell is still someone who has been a huge part of that narrative shift in Houston. And so, going up against an untested rookie, a guy who a lot of people have respected in this league, can say has been a pretty integral part of what the Lions are trying to build in their secondary. It's going to be his toughest test because, yes, the Lions should have the upper hand, but don't underestimate what this Houston Texans offense can do because they still have players who buy into this culture and buy into it well and know what they want to achieve. And so that's something that you're going to have to monitor in this matchup if you're a little bit wary of how Tank Dell might play out in this one. Because looking at it from another perspective, Tank Dell might not even align up against Terrion Arnold for much of this game. He might be lined up against, like I said, Ryan Branch in a too high system to limit his deep threat ability. He might be lined up against Kirby Joseph. Who knows? I feel like this matchup, when it happens, will have the biggest impact because this is the weakness of both of these teams. For Houston, it's the lack of depth at wide receiver and where they are right now, where Tank Dell is their top receiver. And for the Detroit Lions, the fact that, yes, you're in Carpa, which you've seen the secondary, but haven't really been tested in that regard with a team that wants to match up and be physical with you against, nonetheless, a untested rookie at this point. So this is one that I'm really excited to see play out due to how both of these teams' deficiencies look on paper on the field. The third one I want to talk about is another weird one, another game intra-conference that's big as well. George Pickens going up against Benjamin St-Juste, a guy in the Washington Commanders secondary. We've been calling the question. This matchup, I understand, could change because of the trade to Marshawn Lattimore, who now becomes presumptively the CB1 there in Washington. But this is one of those matchups where, again, it's a little like the Devontae Smith matchup, except that George Pickens is the wide receiver 1, and he's more of the A.J. Brown prototype. He also is, someone that I respect as a route runner, but the name of the game for him is, now that Russ is your quarterback, get on the field more aggressively so that the deep ball has to be respected. And so I feel like this Washington Commanders secondary is starting to become a little bit privy to what teams are doing to them. And so this matchup is tougher than it looks for George Pickens. I feel like, Benjamin St-Juste is the most vulnerable Commanders corner in this system, just because, I feel like he's not necessarily regarded as highly as, say, a product in Emmanuel Forbes or Marshawn Lattimore, who they now have. So I feel like if it's George Pickens against St-Juste most of the time, no matter how they line up, then I feel like this is one where George Pickens should feel like he wins. But also one in which Benjamin St-Juste kind of is now familiarized with what defenses want to do to him, because that's what has been the problem for Washington. They've gotten a little bit punked in terms of their pass defense. So now, in order to adjust, yes, they traded for Lattimore, but also in-house, they feel like they have the plan they need going forward and the identity they need going forward to limit guys of this caliber like Pickens. This will be the first true test with all of those guys they've compiled. The guy that they brought in from trade with Marshawn Lattimore, St-Juste, some other guys like Forbes in there as well, even their linebackers as well. This will be the true litmus test for what they've seen and how they respond to what they've seen this season on the defensive side of the football. And it's going to be an exciting one. This is a first-time matchup, I believe. So look for, George Pickens to stick to what he knows best, sticks to this new offensive credo that the Steelers seem to be employing, and look for the Washington Commanders to start to understand how to win corner wide receiver matchups a little bit better. Then the last one that I want to discuss before we end today's show is one that also a little bit less important, but still one that I wanted to throw out there, a potential flyer. This guy might have lost his luster with the loss of one of his teammates. Calvin Ridley going up against Cam Hart. This is an unusual match because it's not a high-profile one like many of the others. But it is one on a lower level scale that could define, whether or not the Chargers are for real, and if the Titans have any hope in terms of maintaining and retaining a player like Calvin Ridley. Because the futures for these teams are headed in drastically different directions. The Titans, seemingly no answer to their QB situation, whereas the Chargers seem to be really buying into this new philosophy. Physicality on defense, physicality on offense. And it's playing out to great effect because the Chargers' defense was always solid, even when Brandon Staley was there. It's just that, in this regime change, maybe some players might have, lost a little bit of confidence in themselves. But they're really playing one of the most confident units in the league. But this is the matchup, right? Where you kind of feel like the Titans can see if they can build upon the positives of their team. Whereas Cam Hart, this is his rookie year, I believe, might be one of the weaker links in this Chargers secondary. And so Calvin Ridley, yes, not performed as well as people might have hoped, but still someone who can affect this team and really reinvigorate it. And not for nothing, Mason Rudolph has shown signs of, being competent enough to lead this offense. So if you can get some big plays out of Calvin Ridley and exploit, this rookie corner, then, the Titans might have something going. For the Chargers, is much less of a concern. And for the Titans, I want to see what this means for their future, because Calvin Ridley might also not be here by the end of the season for the Titans, and they need something, some glimmer of optimism to prove that they're really headed somewhere rather than just in a downward trajectory. But that'll just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am Christopher Shepard, your faithful host. Thank you all for tuning in. Come back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network. And also consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube as we stream. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in. I am out until tomorrow.